Truth and Method. Chapter 1, Part 1. Judgment. This development of the concept of sensus communis in 18th century Germany may explain why it is so closely connected with the concept of judgment. Gesunder Menschenverstand, good sense, sometimes called gemeiner Verstand, common understanding, is in fact decisively characterized by judgment. The difference between a fool and a sensible man is that the former lacks judgment, i.e., he is not able to subsume correctly, and hence cannot apply correctly what he has learned and knows. The word judgment was introduced in the 18th century in order to convey the concept of judicium, which was considered to be a basic intellectual virtue. In the same way, the English moral philosophers emphasized that moral and aesthetic judgments do not obey reason, but have the character of sentiment, or taste. And similarly, Titans, one of the representatives of the German Enlightenment, sees the sensus communis as a judicium without reflection. In fact, the logical basis of judgment, subsuming a particular under a universal, recognizing something as an example of a rule, cannot be demonstrated. Thus, judgment requires a principle to guide its application. In order to follow this principle, another faculty of judgment would be needed, as Kant shrewdly knew. So it cannot be taught in the abstract, but only practiced from case, and is therefore more an ability like the senses. It is something that cannot be learned, because no demonstration from concepts can guide the application of rules. Consequently, German Enlightenment philosophy considered judgment not among the higher, but among the lower powers of the mind. In this respect, it diverged considerably from the original Roman sense of sensus communis, while advancing the scholastic tradition. This was to be especially important for aesthetics. Baumgarten, for example, is quite certain that what judgment recognizes is the sensible individual, the unique thing, and what it judges in the individual thing is its perfection or imperfection. It must be noted that by this definition, judgment does not simply mean applying a pre-given concept of the thing, but that the sensible individual is grasped in itself, insofar as it exhibits the agreement of the many with the one. Not the application of the universal, but internal coherence is what matters. As we can see, this is already what Kant later calls reflective judgment, and he understands it as judgment according to real and formal appropriateness. No concept is given. Rather, the individual object is judged immanently. Kant calls this an aesthetic judgment, and just as Baumgarten described the judicium sensitivum as gustus, so also Kant repeats, a sensible judgment of perfection is called taste. We will see below that this aesthetic development of the concept of judicium, for which Gottsched was primarily responsible in the 18th century, acquired a systematic significance for Kant, although it will also emerge that Kant's distinction between determinate and reflective judgment is not without its problems. Moreover, it is difficult to reduce the meaning of sensus communis to aesthetic judgment. From the use that Vico and Shaftesbury make of this concept, it appears that sensus communis is not primarily a formal capacity, an intellectual faculty to be used, but already embraces a sum of judgments and criteria for judgment that determine its contents. Common sense is exhibited primarily in making judgments about right and wrong, proper and improper. Whoever has a sound judgment is not thereby enabled to judge particulars under universal viewpoints, but he knows what is really important, i.e., he sees things from right and sound points of view. A swindler who correctly calculates human weakness and always makes the right move in his deceptions, nevertheless does not possess sound judgment in the highest sense of the term. Thus, the universality that is ascribed to the faculty of judgment is by no means as common as Kant thinks. Judgment is not so much a faculty as a demand that has to be made of all. Everyone has enough sense of the common, i.e., judgment, that he can be expected to show a sense of the community, genuine moral and civic solidarity, but that means judgment of right and wrong, and a concern for the common good. This is what makes Vico's reliance on the humanistic tradition so impressive, For against the intellectualization of the concept of the sense of the community, he firmly retains all the wealth of meaning that lived in the Roman tradition of this word, and to this day is characteristic of the Latin race. Similarly, when Shaftesbury took up the concept, it was, as we have seen, also linked to the political and social tradition of humanism. The sensus communis is an element of social and moral being. Even when this concept was associated with a polemical attack on metaphysics, as in Pietism and Scottish philosophy, it still retained its original critical function. By contrast, Kant's version of this idea in his critique of judgment has quite a different emphasis. There is no longer any systematic place for the concept's basic moral sense. As we know, he developed his moral philosophy in explicit opposition to the doctrine of moral feeling that had been worked out in English philosophy. Thus, he totally excluded the concept of sensus communis from moral philosophy. What appears with the unconditionality of a moral imperative cannot be based on feeling, not even if one does not mean an individual's feeling, but common moral sensibility. For the imperative immanent in morality totally excludes any comparative reflection about others. The unconditionality of a moral imperative certainly does not mean that the moral consciousness must remain rigid in judging others. Rather, it is morally imperative to detach oneself from the subjective private conditions of one's own judgment and to assume the standpoint of the other person. But this unconditionality also means that the moral consciousness cannot avoid appealing to the judgment of others. The obligatoriness of the imperative is universal in a stricter sense than the universality of sensibility can ever attain. Applying the moral law to the will is a matter for judgment, but since it is a question of judgment operating under the laws of pure practical reason, its task consists precisely in preserving one from the empiricism of practical reason, which bases the practical concepts of good and bad merely on empirical consequences. This is done by the schema of pure practical reason. For Kant, there is also another question: how to implant the stern law of pure practical reason in the human mind. He deals with this in the methodology of pure practical reason, which endeavors to provide a brief outline of the method of engendering and cultivating genuine moral attitudes. For this, he in fact calls on ordinary human reason, and he wants to exercise and cultivate practical judgment, and certainly aesthetic elements play their part also. But that moral feeling can be cultivated is not really part of moral philosophy, and in any case, it is not relevant to its foundations. For Kant requires that our will be determined only by motives founded on the self-legislation of pure practical reason. This cannot be based on a mere commonness of sensibility, but only on an obscure but still securely guiding practical act of will, to clarify and strengthen which is the task of the critique of practical reason. The sensus communis plays no part in Kant, not even in the logical sense. What Kant treats in the transcendental doctrine of judgment, i.e., the doctrine of schematism and the principles, no longer has anything to do with the sensus communis. For here we are concerned with concepts that are supposed to refer to their objects a priori, and not with the subsumption of the particular under the universal. When, however, we are really concerned with the ability to grasp the particular as an instance of the universal, and we speak of sound understanding, then this is, according to Kant, something that is common in the truest sense of the word, i.e., it is something to be found everywhere, but to possess it is by no means any merit or advantage. The only significance of this sound understanding is that it is a preliminary stage of cultivated and enlightened reason. It is active in an obscure kind of judgment called feeling, but it still judges according to concepts, though commonly only according to obscurely imagined principles, and it certainly cannot be considered a special sense of community. The universal logical use of judgment, which goes back to the sensus communis, contains no principle of its own. Thus, from the whole range of what could be called a sense faculty of judgment, for Kant only the judgment of aesthetic taste is left. Here one may speak of a true sense of community. Doubtful though it may be whether one may speak of knowledge in connection with aesthetic taste, and certain though it is that aesthetic judgments are not made according to concepts, it is still the case that aesthetic taste necessarily implies universal agreement, even if it is sensory and not conceptual. Thus, the true sense of community, says Kant, is taste. That is a paradoxical formulation, when we recall that the 18th century enjoyed discussing precisely diversities of human taste. But even if one draws no skeptical, relativistic conclusions from differences of taste, but holds on to the idea of good taste, it sounds paradoxical to call good taste this strange distinction that differentiates the members of a cultivated society from all other men, a sense of community. Taken as an empirical statement that would in fact be absurd, and we shall see how far this description has meaning for Kant's transcendental purpose, i.e., as an a priori justification for undertaking a criticism of taste. But we shall also have to ask how the truth claim implicit in the sense of community is affected by narrowing the concept of the sense of community to a judgment of taste about what is beautiful, and how the Kantian subjective a priori of taste has affected the self-understanding of the human sciences. Taste. Again, we must go back further in time. It is not only a question of narrowing the concept of the sense of community to taste, but of narrowing the concept of taste itself. The long history of this idea before Kant made it. The basis of his critique of judgment shows that the concept of taste was originally more a moral than an aesthetic idea. It describes an ideal of genuine humanity and receives its character from the effort to take a critical stand against the dogmatism of the school. It was only later that the use of the idea was limited to the aesthetic. Balthasar Gracian stands at the beginning of this history. Gracian starts from the view that the sense of taste, this most animal and most inward of our senses, still contains the beginnings of the intellectual differentiation we make in judging things. Thus, the sensory differentiation of taste, which accepts or rejects in the most immediate way, is in fact not merely an instinct, but strikes a balance between sensory instinct and intellectual freedom. The sense of taste is able to gain the distance necessary for choosing and judging what is the most urgent necessity of life. Thus, Gracian already sees in taste a spiritualization of animality, and rightly points out that there is cultivation not only of the mind, but also of taste, gusto. This is true also, of course, of sensory taste. There are men who have a good tongue, gourmets who cultivate these delights. This idea of gusto is the starting point for Gracian's ideal of social cultivation. His ideal of the cultivated man, the discreto, is that, as an hombre en su punto, he achieves the proper freedom of distance from all the things of life and society, so that he is able to make distinctions and choices consciously and reflectively. Gracian's ideal of cultivation was supposed to be a completely new departure. It replaced that of the Christian courtier. It is remarkable within the history of Western ideals of cultivation for being independent of class. It sets out the ideal of a society based on cultivation. This ideal of social cultivation seems to emerge everywhere in the wake of absolutism and its suppression of the hereditary aristocracy. Thus, the history of the idea of taste follows the history of absolutism from Spain to France and England, and is closely bound up with the antecedents of the Third Estate. Taste is not only the ideal created by a new society, but we see this ideal of good taste, producing what was subsequently called good society. It no longer recognizes and legitimates itself on the basis of birth and rank, but simply through the shared nature of its judgments, or rather, its capacity to rise above narrow interests and private predilections to the title of judgment. The concept of taste undoubtedly implies a mode of knowing. The mark of good taste is being able to stand back from ourselves and our private preferences. Thus, taste, in its essential nature, is not private but a social phenomenon of the first order. It can even counter the private inclinations of the individual, like a court of law, in the name of a universality that it intends and represents. One can like something that one's own taste rejects. The verdict of taste is curiously decisive. Kant rightly says that in matters of taste there can be a disagreement, but not a disputation, not just because there are no universal conceptual criteria that everyone must accept, but because one does not look for them and would not even think it right if they existed. One must have taste. One cannot learn through demonstration, nor can one replace it by mere imitation. Nevertheless, taste is not a mere private quality, for it always endeavors to be good taste. The decisiveness of the judgment of taste includes its claim to validity. Good taste is always sure of its judgment, i.e., it is essentially sure taste, an acceptance and rejection that involves no hesitation, no surreptitious glances at others, no searching for reasons. Taste is therefore something like a sense. In its operation, it has no knowledge of reasons. If taste registers a negative reaction to something, it is not able to say why, but it experiences it with the greatest certainty. Sureness of taste is therefore safety from the tasteless. It is a remarkable thing that we are especially sensitive to the negative in the decisions taste renders. The corresponding positive is not properly speaking what is tasteful, but what does not offend taste. That, above all, is what taste judges. Taste is defined precisely by the fact that it is offended by what is tasteless and thus avoids it, like anything else that threatens injury. Thus, the contrary of good taste actually is not bad taste. Its opposite is rather to have no taste. Good taste is a sensitivity which so naturally avoids anything blatant that its reaction is quite incomprehensible to someone who has no taste. A phenomenon closely connected with taste is fashion. Here, the element of social generalization implicit in the idea of taste becomes a determining reality. But the very distinction from fashion shows that the universality of taste has quite a different basis and is not the same as empirical universality. This is the essential point for Kant. The very word fashion, mode, implies that the concept involves a changeable law, modus within a constant whole of sociable demeanor. What is merely a matter of mode has no other norm than that given by what everybody does. Fashion regulates as it likes only those things that can equally well be one way as another. It is indeed constituted by empirical universality, consideration for others, comparison, and seeing things from the general point of view. Thus, fashion creates a social dependence that is difficult to shake off. Kant is quite right when he considers it better to be a fool in fashion than to be against fashion, even though it is foolish to take fashion too seriously. By contrast, the phenomenon of taste is an intellectual faculty of differentiation. Taste operates in a community but is not subservient to it. On the contrary, good taste is distinguished by the fact that it is able to adapt itself to the direction of taste represented by fashion, or, contrariwise, is able to adapt what is demanded by fashion to its own good taste. Part of the concept of taste, then, is that one observes measure even in fashion, not blindly following its changing dictates but using one's own judgment. One maintains one's own style, i.e., one relates the demands of fashion to a whole that one's own taste keeps in view, and accepts only what harmonizes with this whole and fits together as it does. Thus, taste not only recognizes this or that as beautiful, but has an eye to the whole, with which everything that is beautiful must harmonize. Thus, taste is not a social sense, that is, dependent on an empirical universality, the complete unanimity of the judgments of others. It does not say that everyone will agree with our judgment, but that they should agree with it, as Kant says. Against the tyranny exercised by fashion, sure taste preserves a specific freedom and superiority. This is its special normative power, peculiar to it alone, the knowledge that it is certain of the agreement of an ideal community. In contrast to tastes being governed by fashion, we see here the ideality of good taste. It follows that taste knows something, though admittedly in a way that cannot be separated from the concrete moment in which that object occurs and cannot be reduced to rules and concepts. Just this is obviously what gives the idea of taste its original breadth, that it constitutes a special way of knowing. Like reflective judgment, it belongs in the realm of that which grasps, in the individual object, the universal under which it is to be subsumed. Both taste and judgment evaluate the object in relation to a whole in order to see whether it fits in with everything else, that is, whether it is fitting. One must have a sense for it. It cannot be demonstrated. This kind of sense is obviously needed wherever a whole is intended, but not given as a whole, that is, conceived in purposive concepts. Thus, taste is in no way limited to what is beautiful in nature and art, judging it in respect to its decorative quality, but embraces the whole realm of morality and manners. Even moral concepts are never given as a whole, or determined in a normatively univocal way. Rather, the ordering of life by the rules of law and morality is incomplete and needs productive supplementation. Judgment is necessary in order to make a correct evaluation of the concrete instance. We are familiar with this function of judgment, especially from jurisprudence, where the supplementary function of hermeneutics consists in concretizing the law. At issue is always something more than the correct application of general principles. Our knowledge of law and morality, too, is always supplemented by the individual case, even productively determined by it. The judge not only applies the law in concreto, but contributes through his very judgment to developing the law. Judge-made law. Like law, morality is constantly developed through the fecundity of the individual case. Thus judgment, as the evaluation of the beautiful and sublime, is by no means productive only in the area of nature and art. One cannot even say, with Kant, that the productivity of judgment is to be found chiefly in this area. Rather, the beautiful in nature and art is to be supplemented by the whole ocean of the beautiful spread throughout the moral reality of mankind. It is only with respect to the exercise of pure theoretical and practical reason that one can speak of subsuming the individual under a given universal, Kant's determinate judgment. But in fact, even here, an aesthetic judgment is involved. Kant indirectly admits this inasmuch as he acknowledges the value of examples for sharpening the judgment. Admittedly, he adds the qualification. Correctness and precision of intellectual insight, on the other hand, they more usually somewhat impair. For only very seldom do they adequately fulfill the requirements of the rule. But the other side of this qualification is obviously that the case which functions as an example is in fact something different from just a case of the rule. Hence, to do real justice to it, even if merely in technical or practical judgment, always includes an aesthetic element. To that extent, the distinction between determinate and reflective judgment, on which Kant bases his critique of judgment, is not absolute. It is clearly not only a matter of logical but of aesthetic judgment. The individual case on which judgment works is never simply a case. It is not exhausted by being a particular example of a universal law or concept. Rather, it is always an individual case, and it is significant that we call it a special case, because the rule does not comprehend it. Every judgment about something intended in its concrete individuality, e.g., the judgment required in a situation that calls for action, is, strictly speaking, a judgment about a special case. That means nothing less than that judging the case involves not merely applying the universal principle according to which it is judged, but co-determining, supplementing, and correcting that principle. From this it ultimately follows that all moral decisions require taste, which does not mean that this most individual balancing of decision is the only thing that governs them, but it is an indispensable element. It is truly an achievement of indemonstrable tact to hit the target and to discipline the application of the universal, the moral law, in a way that reason itself cannot. Thus, taste is not the ground but the supreme consummation of moral judgment. The man who finds that what is bad goes against his taste has the greatest certainty in accepting the good and rejecting the bad, as great as the certainty of that most vital of our senses, which chooses or rejects food. Thus, the emergence of the concept of taste in the 17th century, the social and socially cohesive function, of which we have indicated above, has connections with moral philosophy that go back to antiquity. There is a humanistic and thus ultimately Greek component at work in Christian moral philosophy. Greek ethics, the ethics of measure in the Pythagoreans and Plato, the ethics of the mean that Aristotle developed, is in a profound and comprehensive sense an ethics of good taste. Such a thesis admittedly sounds strange to our ears, in part because we generally fail to recognize the ideal normative element in the concept of taste, and are still affected by the relativistic skeptical argument about differences of taste. But above all, we are influenced by Kant's achievement in moral philosophy, which purified ethics from all aesthetics and feeling. If we now examine the importance of Kant's critique of judgment for the history of the human sciences, we must say that his giving aesthetics a transcendental philosophical basis had major consequences and constituted a turning point. It was the end of a tradition, but also the beginning of a new development. It restricted the idea of taste to an area in which, as a special principle of judgment, it could claim independent validity, and, by so doing, limited the concept of knowledge to the theoretical and practical use of reason. The limited phenomenon of judgment, restricted to the beautiful and sublime, was sufficient for his transcendental purpose, but it shifted the more general concept of the experience of taste and the activity of aesthetic judgment in law and morality out of the center of philosophy. The importance of this cannot be easily overestimated, for what was here surrendered was the element in which philological and historical studies lived, and when they sought to ground themselves methodologically under the name of human sciences, side by side with the natural sciences, it was the only possible source of their full self-understanding. Now Kant's transcendental analysis made it impossible to acknowledge the truth claim of traditionary materials, to the cultivation and study of which they devoted themselves. But this meant that the methodological uniqueness of the human sciences lost its legitimacy. In his critique of aesthetic judgment, what Kant sought to and did, legitimate, was the subjective universality of aesthetic taste, in which there is no longer any knowledge of the object, and in the area of the fine arts the superiority of genius to any aesthetics based on rules. Thus, Romantic hermeneutics and history found a point of contact for their self-understanding only in the concept of genius, validated by Kant's aesthetics. That was the other side of Kant's influence. The transcendental justification of aesthetic judgment was the basis of the autonomy of aesthetic consciousness, and on the same basis, historical consciousness was to be legitimized as well. The radical subjectivization involved in Kant's new way of grounding aesthetics was truly epoch-making. In discrediting any kind of theoretical knowledge except that of natural science, it compelled the human sciences to rely on the methodology of the natural sciences in conceptualizing themselves. But it made this reliance easier by offering the artistic element, feeling, and empathy as subsidiary elements. Helmholtz's description of the human sciences, which I considered above, is in both respects a good example of the Kantian influence. If we want to show what is inadequate about this kind of self-interpretation on the part of the human sciences and open up more appropriate possibilities, we will have to proceed with the problems of aesthetics. The transcendental function that Kant ascribes to the aesthetic judgment is sufficient to distinguish it from conceptual knowledge and hence to determine the phenomena of the beautiful and of art. But is it right to reserve the concept of truth for conceptual knowledge? Must we not also acknowledge that the work of art possesses truth? We shall see that acknowledging this places not only the phenomenon of art, but also that of history in a new light.